thanks very much for joining us. As you know, we like to spend a bit of time at the end of each year with our two United States senators. And as is so often the case, production schedules and the Senate schedules require or mandate a bit of a gap between the time we record this program and the time that it's seen. In this case, the Honorable Tom Cotton, it will be approximately 29 days from the time we're having this conversation until it airs. So the viewer is sort of advised that our conversations may be necessarily, thematic, I guess, in a way. It's been a pretty interesting first year for you in the United States Senate. You were accused on several occasions, or it was said of you, I'll put it that way, on several occasions, that you were a bit overheated for a freshman. Looking back, you were on afterburners almost from the first day. Looking back, do you wish you'd toned it down a bit?
Now, Steve, when I ran last year in our campaign, I said that I was going to go be a voice for Arkansas. The Senate's a special place in our political system, really in our society. For a small state like Arkansas, it's one of the rare times when we have an equal voice as a big state like California or New York, Texas or Florida, and so forth. And especially on the biggest issues, the life or death issues, I wanted to stand up for what I was hearing from Arkansans. Maybe the most consequential of those issues is the Iran nuclear deal. Early on in my tenure, I authored a letter that 46 other senators signed, to include our Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, to the leadership of Iran, that said simply that if a deal like this, a nuclear arms control agreement with a mortal enemy that still chants death to America, is not submitted to the Senate for ratification as a treaty, then it's not binding on our Congress or any future president. Now, the administration has taken that position, and every Republican presidential candidate has taken the position that they will unwind that deal when they come into office. Although the president is moving forward with the deal, I do think that that's a real impact for the people of Arkansas and for the entire country.
And there was criticism of that letter and you and the co-signers on the grounds that it came close to a Logan Act violation, that it was an improper exercise of the congressional voice in the midst of these negotiations. You don't agree?
No, the Constitution gives the Senate in particular, but the Congress as a whole, an important voice in our foreign policy, because our founding fathers didn't want to entrust the conduct of foreign policy to a single person, whoever that person may be, of whatever party. In our system, the president is supposed to negotiate treaties and other agreements, but the Senate has to ratify treaties, or Congress has to approve binding international agreements. You know, Senator Robert Byrd, who was an icon in the Democratic Party in the Senate for many years, traveled to Moscow in 1979, shortly after Leonid Brezhnev had negotiated and signed the SALT II nuclear arms control treaty, to share his views. More recently, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader of the House, traveled to Syria to meet with Bashar al-Assad against the wishes of the Bush administration at the time. I would say that what we did was much more measured. We simply stated our views as the predominant majority in our Senate conference, that anything that deals with a nuclear arms control agreement with a mortal enemy should have the voice of the American people behind it. It shouldn't be negotiated just by the president.
So it was not then, the intent then was not necessarily just to scuttle the deal, as it was suggested.
Well, if anything, it should have given the president more authority. This is something that presidents over time have done. They've cited our Constitution and the requirement that we have a two-thirds majority to ratify treaties to drive a better deal with our adversaries around the world. Again, that's part of the reason why our founding fathers required two-thirds majority ratification of treaties in the Senate, to make sure that those most kind of consequential agreements, the things that war are often started over, have bipartisan, cross-regional, widespread support among the American people. President Obama, if anything, should have shown that kind of congressional opposition to get a stronger hand with the Iranians in the negotiations.
It wasn't a treaty, though, as he and the Secretary pointed out.
Well, what is or is not a treaty has often been a matter of political judgment between the branches. It's not a simple legal question. But they have since acknowledged that it's not a treaty. They've even acknowledged that it's not a binding and signed agreement. Just earlier this month, we're taping here on December 4th, but just in early December, the State Department said not only is it not a treaty, there's not even a signed copy of an agreement. It's simply a matter of political commitments between President Obama and the leadership of Iran and the other negotiating parties, which proves our point that in the future, a future Congress or a future president can make a different political commitment or withdraw from this political commitment.
Iran, you've referred to twice or three times, I think now, as a mortal enemy. True. I mean, I don't mean that, but to what extent is it a mortal enemy? Do you really think it is a mortal enemy when, in fact, Iran is caught? We apparently have a shared interest in containing ISIS. Well, there has been some cooperation.
Well, expecting Iran to try to defeat ISIS is like expecting gasoline to douse a fire. Iran's nefarious activities throughout the Middle East, but especially in Iraq and in Syria, in supporting radical Shiite militias or radical Shiite terror groups like Hezbollah or Bashar al-Assad's tyranny in Syria, has actually fomented a lot of the sectarian conflict between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. ISIS has played off that. So in the end, there are two kinds of threats from radical Islam in the Middle East. There's the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood threat, and then the Iran, Hezbollah, Assad threat. We have to recognize that you can't play one off the other. We have to defeat both of them. And Iran still chants death to America in their streets. We should not give a country that chants death to America, whose very reason is to foment Islamic revolution around the world, the nuclear means to make good on those chants.
A scholar, fair to say, a scholar of Middle Eastern affairs, notes or said to me that the Iranians chanting death to America in the streets is a bit like Longhorn saying, Razorback saying beat Texas. I mean, it's kind of a rote, kind of a cheer, and if the situation's not quite as vile as that might make it appear. That actually there's a great deal of admiration among the Iranian people for the United States. They just don't like our policies.
Well, are
we overcooking that aspect?
In my experience, when people say they're going to try to kill you, especially in foreign policy, you should take them seriously. Iran killed hundreds of American soldiers in Iraq. They've killed Americans from Beirut to Baghdad, and they continue to be the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. You're right that the Iranian people, millions and millions of the Iranian people, are pro-American, pro-Western. They don't want to live under radical ayatollahs. But right now, as long as the government of Iran is run by those radical ayatollahs, then they will be a mortal threat to the U.S., both in their conventional activities in supporting terror or trying to destabilize the Middle East, and the long-term threat they would pose if they develop nuclear weapons.
Do you have, what policy would you design? First of all, it was Dr. Huntington's theme, but some time ago, there would be this eventual clash, as he styled it, clash of civilizations. Are we seeing that now in your estimation?
Well, throughout the Middle East, we're seeing a growing sectarian war between Sunni Muslims on the one hand and Shiite Muslims on the other. This is not good for the United States. You're also seeing divisions within the Sunni world between, say, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's not good when two radical Islamic groups are vying with each other for preeminence in who can kill the most Americans. This is a result, in my opinion, in part of the failure of U.S. leadership, of the hasty withdrawal of all of our troops out of our in 2011 that gave Al-Qaeda in Iraq a chance to morph into the Islamic State, as well as inaction in places like Syria that let what began as street protests become into a chaotic civil war that David Petraeus, former general commanding that area, has said is like a geopolitical Chernobyl, and its fallout is now radiating all around the world. So ultimately what the region needs is U.S. engagement and leadership, and on my conversations with leaders from that region, as well as trips to the region, they're crying out for more U.S. engagement. That doesn't mean what we had in Iraq in the last decade, 100,000 troops patrolling the streets, but it does mean more than what we're doing right now.
What to the argument, Senator, that an expanded U.S. force in the Middle East is exactly what ISIS wants in terms of snagging the U.S. In the region, further entangling it in the region, and for its value as a bargaining, not as a bargaining chip, but as a recruiting tool?
Well, I think right now what we're doing is giving ISIS what it wants, which is half measures that shows that ISIS is able to stand up to the United States and NATO and the broader Western world, that aren't dealing them a mortal blow. We need to make ISIS and life in ISIS miserable. We need every disaffected young teenage Muslim boy around the world who's thinking about going to join the caliphate and fight against the West to realize that he's not going to be able to buy a Christian sex slave. He's not going to be able to achieve glorious martyrdom. His life is going to be miserable. It's going to be holed up with lack of food and lack of water, trying to dodge United States bombs or trying to dodge a ground force that would largely be provided by the Muslim world. But it takes U.S. leadership to lead that kind of coalition. I've spoken with heads of states from this world that say they're willing to help put boots on the ground, but only if the United States is willing to be more deeply engaged and help lead that coalition.
At this time of our conversation, the administration has committed or says it's going to a few thousand more. Is that enough? Inadequate? What?
Well,
advisors.
I would say there's no like talismanic number about the number of troops we need. We already have about 3,500, 4,000 troops on the ground in Iraq. Some former generals whom I respect have said they think we need around 10 to 15,000. What we need, though, in my opinion, is simply the political will that reflects what the majority of American people are saying is we will do what's necessary to win the war. And we will tell our generals, you give us the courses of action that you think are necessary to win, and then we will support that. It may be 3,000 more troops, it may be 10,000 more troops. But the main decision is the willingness to put the small number of troops on the ground that we need to actually lead a coalition and defeat the Islamic State.
The policy will, the political will, but I was going to ask, what about the popular will in the American?
Well, for most Arkansans with whom I speak, especially in the aftermath of the Paris attacks in November, they want to do whatever it takes to defeat the Islamic State. They know the Islamic State is not taking options off the table. They're not respecting international boundaries. They want to know why we're not. If you just look at the course of our air campaign over the last year, we're dropping substantially fewer bombs on the Islamic State and their forces than we did at the start of the Iraq War, or the war in Afghanistan, or the Kosovo air campaign under President Clinton, or the first Persian Gulf War under President H.W. Bush. What we need to do is to take the gloves off and make sure that we actually defeat the Islamic State. That's the President's stated goal, but he's not putting the resources necessary towards it.
Are they are the powers now, or the administration, is it now, to include the Pentagon, are they overly concerned with civilian casualties or the collateral damage, which seems to be principal factor? Well, they're thinking in terms of military action.
Well, I certainly don't want to see civilian casualties either, but I'm a bit more concerned about casualties in Little Rock than I am in Iraq and Syria. If you just take, though, what the United States and the coalition did to the oil trucks shortly after the Paris attack. These oil trucks have been running smuggled oil out of ISIS-controlled territory for months. Our air forces, with coalition forces, dropped leaflets on these trucks saying we're about to bomb you. The reason they did that is those truck drivers most likely have been impressed into driving trucks for ISIS. ISIS says you're a truck driver, you're going to drive trucks for us, otherwise we're going to cut your head off and kill your family. So we didn't want to kill those drivers. We leafleted them, we gave them a chance to get out of their vehicles, then we bombed their vehicles. We could have been doing that 6 months ago. We could be doing the same thing to their refineries as well. There's a way that we can be a lot more aggressive in our bombing campaign without taking on that much more risk of civilian casualty. But ultimately, if we don't become more aggressive in Syria and Iraq, we're going to see more civilian casualties in Europe and ultimately in the United States when terrorists strike us here.
No one would argue that it's a near-term proposition. But in terms of some sort of accommodation between the Islamic world, estimates from 1.4 to 1.6 billion Muslims on the planet, excuse me. But some accommodation between the Islamic world and the West. Excuse me, not a near-term proposition, but how do you see this thing evolving, or can it evolve without massive bloodshed? Does the answer start within the Islamic world itself?
It does, because ultimately the Islamic world needs reformers who are going to ostracize and ultimately defeat radical Islamic terrorists. President el-Sisi in Egypt has made a lot of statements about the need for this, about the need to have a reformation within the Islamic world. There are plenty of countries like Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country by population, that have a relatively stable and representative style government and don't foment radicalism. We need to spread that model around the world. It does take an effort whenever you have a group like ISIS that gets a foothold, but ultimately we need, through the leadership of our partners in the Islamic world, as well as military support in that fight, if we're going to defeat the threat of radical Islam. It's not a large number of Muslims around the world, but 1.5 billion is a pretty big base. If it's just 1/10 of 1%, you're still talking about the millions of numbers. And we have to make it clear to radical Islamic terrorists around the world that This is a simple proposition. We will win and they will lose.
Well, it's so infinitely complicated. You mentioned the administration, the current administration in Egypt, which has jailed some of its enemies that were popularly elected, perhaps our biggest ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. And you mentioned Iran as an exporter of terrorism. The Saudi royal family has underwritten the most extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism, put it that way. It's rather more complicated than we would like to believe, correct?
Well, there have been malign influences in Saudi Arabia and certain parts of the royal family, and they had their own spate of terrorist attacks during their crackdown in the 2001 to 2005 time period. But since then, they have done a very effective job of cutting the flow of financing to terrorist groups. The current crown prince, the number 2 in charge of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Nayef, has been a long-time security partner with the United States. So they're trying to do the right thing. That doesn't mean that they don't have serious problems in places like Saudi Arabia and like Egypt, but a lot of our traditional partners, like those 2 countries, as well as the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait and so forth, in my conversations with them and my trips to those countries, they recognize the mortal threat that both Iran and groups like ISIS pose to them. They want to defeat them. They simply need leadership to help.
You and all of your colleagues in the Arkansas delegation, a good many members of Congress, have suggested we, on the matter of Syrian immigration, refugee immigration, whoa, slow down. Mm-hmm. Are you at all, excuse me, hay fever, are you at all, Senator, concerned that your concerns have not been adequately addressed by the administration, even though it is now making clear that it's going to be a 2-year vetting process or something along that?
I remain concerned. The current FBI director, who was appointed by President Obama, has said the quality of background checks really depends on the quality of information you have, and we simply don't have very good information or databases coming out of Syria. Ultimately, though, the refugee crisis caused by the Syrian war is just a symptom. The disease is the war that started when Bashar al-Assad turned his own guns on his own people when they were protesting 4 years ago. And we're not going to be able to address that symptoms until we ultimately address the disease. If we take 10,000 Syrian refugees in the United States, if Europe takes 160,000 as they proposed, that is still a tiny drop in the bucket of the number of Syrians who have been displaced for their homes. Something like 4 million who have gone abroad, probably another 6 or 7 million inside the country, about half of their 22 million population. I sat in the largest refugee camp in Jordan, about 10 kilometers from the Syrian border, in September, met with some young Syrian families, and they said that 10 million Syrians don't want to come to the United States or to Western Europe. They want one Syrian to leave Syria, and that's Bashar al-Assad. So until we have a strategy that actually defeats both the Islamic State and the access of Iran and Syria, we're going to continue to face the refugee problem.
Well, but the benefit, is there not a psychic benefit as well as a humanitarian benefit to accepting these refugees, some in the United States, if nothing else is the
if we can be confident that we are effectively screening them and we're not letting in ISIS terrorists. Now, I'm open to that, but the administration has not yet made the case to me and to most members of Congress or the American people if you look at public opinion polls. I don't think the United States should take a backseat to anyone in the world on what we've done to help Muslim peoples around the world. If you look at the number of Muslims that we've liberated in Iraq in 1991, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq in 2003, what we did in the Balkans to stop an ethnic genocide against Muslims. If you look at the kind of refugee and asylum status that we gave to some of those Muslims from the Balkans in the 1990s, we should be proud of the way that we've protected what's often an oppressed religious minority. But at the same time, the safety and the security of the American people has to come first.
Domestic issues. Well, you got a highway bill out.
Yes, we did.
And a new interstate, I guess, which makes possible, what, 555 now?
Yes, so I ultimately oppose the highway bill. I wish I was able to vote for it. There's some good measures in the highway bill for the state of Arkansas. A little bit of increased funding. You mentioned Interstate 555. We were able to get an interstate designation for that. In addition to having an ag exemption, so you could drive farm equipment on the road without having an access road. I want to commend Rick Crawford for his very good work on that. There's other programs that were part of the highway bill. A program that will help help veterans become truckers, help expedite the training and the permitting process for them. I would have loved to vote on all those things individually because ultimately I think the highway bill as a whole was a bad bargain for the state of Arkansas. Part of the problem with getting a long-term highway bill has been funding sources. Right now, only about 5% of commuters nationwide take transit. But almost 25% of all funds goes to fund things like streetcars in Los Angeles or subway systems. Those work in some states. Those states should be funding those projects themselves. Arkansas tax dollars shouldn't be going to support that. And although the highway bill is claimed to be deficit neutral, a lot of the funding in that bill, Steve, is very gimmicky. The simplest example is selling about 60 million barrels of oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. One, that petroleum reserve is there for times of war and economic catastrophe, but two, it's assumed that we're going to be able to sell that oil at about $90 a barrel. Well, today oil is trading at $40 a barrel. These are the kind of budget gimmicks that the people of Arkansas are tired of, and this is how we got to $18+ trillion in debt.
Well, and in the meantime, they're asking for highways, highways, highways.
And I would like to see a highway bill that actually builds highways and repairs bridges. And the gas tax alone is almost able to cover the expense of all road construction and maintenance in the United States. The problem is that we simply spend too much of what should be spent on highways on things like streetcars in Los Angeles or landscaping or subway systems, all of which have a legitimate government purpose, but I don't think our federal tax dollars need to be funding those quintessentially local projects in other locales.
Well, Californians could make the same argument. I mean, why are they pay a lot more in taxes? Why are our tax dollars being used to pave 65 back in some place called Arkansas?
Well, the interstate highway system is a perfectly appropriate role for the federal government. Now, I would like to see more authority given from the federal government to the state government. So, you know, for example, our Highway Commission can make decisions inside of Arkansas. Maybe they can form interstate compacts with the states on our border to finish projects like I-49. But the interstate highway system is a perfectly appropriate role for the federal government to play. But when you're getting into what is, you know, essentially a local transportation solutions, like, you know, streetcars in downtown Los Angeles or other big cities or subway systems, those are projects I don't think our federal tax dollars should be funding. I mean, the people of California aren't funding subway systems in Arkansas.
Your party's politics. We only thought we had some fun the last two GOP primary cycles and caucus nominating cycles. What do you make of this, Senator?
I think it's a good thing that we have over a dozen good qualified candidates. The Democrats can't even find one qualified candidate.
Oh, well, no, that's all right. You're allowed that. But
look, Hillary Clinton is their front runner. Hillary Clinton is viewed as untrustworthy by a large majority of the American people, and she's currently under active FBI investigation on whether she disclosed classified information. That doesn't strike me as something that the Democratic Party should be particularly pleased about.
Well, I mean, they would promptly argue that she's being investigated, I think, on some sort of civil basis, and it would not with any criminal intent or intent by the FBI to find any criminal activity. But let me go back to your part. You have Mr. Trump, who says these outrageous things, and as of this morning, he's 30 points ahead of his nearest competitor. Many of the candidates are winning attention for what they say that just seems over the top in another year. Can you kind of reflect on this? Well, what's going on out there in the country?
Well, I mean, I would say that, again, I think it's a good thing the Republican Party has so many capable candidates. We have several sitting senators who are very accomplished, current governors like Chris Christie, John Kasich, very accomplished in their states, former governors like Jeb Bush, or our own former governor, Mike Huckabee, who are all very accomplished. And the fact that they're all running, I think, speaks well of the Republican Party, and it's going to make our eventual nominee that much stronger. But it's also very hard to predict what's going to happen, not just 2 months from today when the first voting occurs, even a month from today when this program airs and the first voting occurs. Because, you know, people make up their minds very late in Iowa and New Hampshire and those early voting states, and there's still a lot of time left in this campaign. But, you know, I think a lot of the candidates on our side are appealing to a sense of frustration in Middle America, in places like Arkansas and Iowa and New Hampshire, at what's happening among elites in Washington. And the candidate that effectively taps into that frustration at the runaway spending and the excessive taxation and the lack of control of our border and the weakness abroad is going to be the candidate that ultimately wins not only a Republican primary, but wins the presidency as well.
Well, are they playing on concerns and fears to an unhealthy extent, though?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot to be fearful of. You know, take what we started out discussing, the Iran deal. We're giving Iran the means to fulfill their promise of death to America. The Islamic State has been conducting attacks around the world in the span of just 2 weeks. They blew up a Russian airliner in the Sinai Peninsula. They killed dozens in Lebanon. Then they killed dozens or over 100 in Paris. Their own leader has stated his intent to make that kind of attack here in the United States. If you look domestically, we still don't have control of our southern border. Our working men and women in this country still haven't seen an increase in their wages for almost 2 decades, in effect, and our government is still $18 trillion in debt. So I think there's both a lot to be fearful of and frustrated about.
A few seconds remaining, Senator. Are you prepared to make an endorsement yet?
For many months, I've been strongly in favor of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary.
Well, how about on your side of the aisle?
Not on our side of the aisle. We vote on March 1 here, so I'll make a choice then with everyone else.
Will you announce it in advance?
I don't have any plans
Your
to
preference?
right now. I don't have any plans to right now.
All right. Senator, thanks very much for your time. Thank you for coming in. And we'll see you next year. Hopefully before then. Thank you for watching. See you next time.